All right, so close your eyes just for a second. Imagine this. Okay. It's the late 1500s. You're leading this daring expedition, right? The second one ever to actually circumnavigate the globe. And you're facing these like treacherous seas and hostile rivals, all for the glory of your queen. And you finally find this haven, right? A fair and good bay to repair your ship and resupply. But get this, centuries later, historians are still like arguing over where you actually landed. Talk
Mm.
about a historical cliffhanger,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Well, that's exactly the mystery that we are tackling today. The enigmatic landing of Sir Francis Drake in 1579. And to help us sort through all the maps and myths, we've got like an expert in ethnohistory with us today. Someone who knows the Native American people of the Pacific Northwest like the back of their hand. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
I'm glad to be here. This is a case that has always kind of fascinated me.
So Sir Francis Drake Wright, a name that's synonymous with exploration, privateering, maybe even a dash of piracy. But this voyage wasn't just about adventure and plunder, was it?
Not at all. Drake was operating on multiple levels. Exploration, challenging Spanish power, seeking resources, and maybe even scouting locations for future English colonies. He was a man on a mission with a lot riding on his success.
And for the longest time, the accepted wisdom was that he landed somewhere around the Bay Area of California.
Right. Exactly. Richard Hakluyt's official account puts the landing at 38 degrees north latitude, which lines up pretty neatly with Drake's Bay in California.
And it's become a real cornerstone of California's historical narrative, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Landmarks, even a freeway named after Drake, they've really embraced the connection.
Oh, absolutely. It's become woven into their identity, a source of pride and a link to this legendary explorer.
But hold on, there's a twist.
Okay.
Back in the early 20th century, a scholar named Zelia Nuttall suggested that the landing might have actually been much further north.
Mm.
And as if things weren't already interesting enough, there's this whole saga of a brass plate discovered in the 20th century claiming to be proof of Drake's California landing.
Oh, yes, the infamous Drake plate. Such a fascinating tale, but ultimately a fabricated story designed to solidify the California narrative.
You mean someone actually forged evidence? That's incredible. What would even be the motive for that?
Well, think about it. Local pride, historical bragging rights, maybe even the potential impact on tourism. Sometimes people get really attached to a particular version of history, even if it takes a bit of a, how do I say this, creative interpretation to maintain it.
It really makes you realize history isn't always as clear-cut as we might think. There are always layers to uncover and different perspectives to consider.
Exactly. It's a reminder to approach historical accounts with a critical eye, always looking for potential biases or hidden agendas.
So let's shift our focus north and talk about this alternative landing site. This is where Melissa Derby's research comes in, right? Her book, Thunder Go North, makes a pretty compelling case, especially when it comes to Drake's interactions with the Native Americans he encountered.
Derby's work is impressive. She's done her homework drawing on all sorts of sources, including fascinating ethnographic data to argue for a landing far north of California.
And it's the ethnographic evidence that really grabbed my attention. What kind of details stood out to you?
Well, for starters, Drake described the native houses as being dug round and covered with planks. This type of semi-subterranean plank house is like a hallmark of Northwest Coast architecture, a far cry from the grass huts you'd find in coastal California at that time.
So the very way they built their homes hints at a completely different location. That's amazing.
It is, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. The types of baskets and foods Drake described also align much more closely with the Kudus people of the Oregon coast than with the indigenous groups of California. And there's this particularly interesting tidbit about a root they called PA, eaten both raw and cooked, and used to make cakes they called sap.
Now that rings a bell. I remember reading about that in Derby's book.
It bears a striking resemblance to a root and bread common among the Chinookan people of the Northwest coast. It's just one more piece of the puzzle that points away from sunny California and towards a more northern landing spot.
It's incredible how these seemingly small cultural details can be so revealing when you're piecing together a historical puzzle.
Absolutely. Ethnographic evidence can be incredibly valuable, especially when written records are scarce or potentially biased. It offers a glimpse into past cultures and societies, allowing us to better understand how people lived, what they valued, and how they interacted with their world.
So we've got the architecture, the basketry, the food. It's starting to paint a picture of a very different location than the one we've traditionally been told about.
And there's more! We haven't even touched on the intriguing clues found in how the Native Americans perceived Drake and his crew. That's where things get really interesting. Well, Derby puts forth this fascinating theory that Drake was mistaken for a god. The god of thunder, no less, by the indigenous people he met.
The god of thunder. Now that's a twist I wasn't expecting. What makes her think that?
Imagine yourself in their shoes. You've never seen anything like Drake's ship before, and suddenly this massive vessel appears on the horizon, booming with cannon fire.
I can see how that would be an absolutely awe-inspiring, maybe even terrifying experience.
Mhm.
It's easy to imagine how that could be interpreted as a supernatural event, especially by people who had never encountered such advanced technology.
Exactly. And to add another layer to this, the Native Americans in that region had beliefs connecting the thunder god to fish and the importance of treating fish with respect. Drake and his crew, being completely unfamiliar with these customs, might have unknowingly done things that seemed sacrilegious to the indigenous people.
So they might have accidentally committed some cultural faux pas, like discarding fish remains improperly or overfishing certain areas, actions that could have been seen as angering the thunder god.
Precisely. And that could explain the veneration Drake described, the burning of sacrifices, the sense of awe, and even fear that the Native Americans displayed towards him and his crew.
It's a reminder that cultural misunderstandings can have a huge impact, especially in those early encounters between vastly different societies.
Absolutely. It underscores the importance of understanding the beliefs and worldviews of the people we're studying, especially when dealing with historical events.
So we've got this compelling ethnographic evidence pointing towards a northern landing, but what about actual documentation from the voyage? Is there anything in Drake's own records or those of his crew that directly contradicts the California narrative?
There is. Drake's own nephew, John Drake, who sailed with him, later gave testimony, placing the Golden Hind as far north as 40 degrees latitude, right around the San Juan Islands and Vancouver Island. That's hundreds of miles north of California.
That's a pretty significant difference. Is there anything from Drake's own logs or journals that backs this up?
There's a document known as the Harley Manuscript, believed to be a draft of Chaplain Francis Fletcher's diary from the voyage. It places their landing at 44 degrees north, which is still far north of California. But here's the kicker. This manuscript seems to have been heavily edited before its official publication.
Edited. So someone intentionally altered the original account. That's starting to sound like a conspiracy theory. What would be the motivation for that?
Well, remember, the political climate of the time, Spain had already laid claim to a huge chunk of the West Coast, including the area around Drake's Bay. If Drake had landed further north, as the evidence suggests, it would have given England a claim to a much larger portion of the territory.
So it was a land grab, essentially. By placing Drake's landing further south, they were limiting England's potential claim on the West Coast. But who would have had the power to alter Drake's records like that?
It's hard to say for sure, but likely someone in a position of authority with a vested interest in promoting a particular narrative. Remember, this was a time of intense rivalry between England and Spain, both vying for power and control on the world stage.
It really makes you appreciate how history is often shaped by those in power, doesn't it? The victors write the history books, as they say.
That's a bit of an oversimplification, but there's certainly some truth to it. It's a reminder that we always need to be critical of the sources we're using and consider who might have benefited from a particular version of events.
So we've got this intriguing web of ethnographic details, potentially altered documents, and political intrigue. It's like a historical detective story.
It certainly is. And at the center of it all is Drake himself. He's a complex figure, a daring explorer, a skilled navigator, but also someone who participated in the slave trade. It's hard to reconcile those different aspects of his character.
It is, and it raises questions about how we judge historical figures. Can we celebrate their accomplishments while still acknowledging their flaws and the problematic aspects of their lives?
That's a question historians and the public continue to grapple with. It's important to remember that people in the past were products of their time. We need to understand their actions within the context of their own era, while still acknowledging the impact of those actions and the complexities of their lives.
It's about finding that balance, recognizing that history is rarely black and white. There are shades of gray in every story, and it's up to us to try to understand those nuances as best we can.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the complexities of the past without shying away from difficult truths. History is not about glorifying or demonizing individuals. It's about understanding the forces that shaped them and the impact they had on the world around them.
It's fascinating to think how our understanding of one event, like Drake's landing, can have such a ripple effect on how we even see history. So what are like the broader implications of this new perspective on Drake's voyage for the history of the Pacific Northwest?
Well, if Drake truly landed further north, it shifts our entire understanding of the timeline of European interaction with the native populations there. We'd have to rethink what we know about early trade routes, cultural exchange, and even like the whole trajectory of colonization in that region.
It's almost like someone moved a key piece on the historical chessboard. Now the whole game looks different.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder what other historical narratives are out there seemingly set in stone that might need a fresh look.
It's a great point. History is a constantly evolving field. New discoveries are made all the time. New technologies emerge that allow us to analyze evidence in new ways. And as we incorporate more diverse perspectives, our understanding of the past is constantly being refined.
It's like we're putting together a giant puzzle, and every now and then a new piece is discovered that changes the entire picture. Speaking of fresh perspectives, what was the most compelling piece of evidence that Derby presented in her book? What really tipped the scales for you?
Honestly, it was the convergence of all the details that clinched it for me. Taken individually, each piece of evidence might have alternative explanations, but when you weave them together, the ethnographic observations, the plank houses, the distinctive basketry, the food culture, combined with the documentary evidence like John Drake's testimony and those curious edits to the Harley manuscript, it paints a remarkably coherent and persuasive picture. It's hard to ignore the weight of all that evidence pointing towards a northern landing.
It's amazing how all those seemingly disparate threads, cultural details, architectural descriptions, obscure historical documents can come together to tell a completely different story than the one we thought we knew.
It really highlights the power of interdisciplinary research, doesn't it? You need the anthropologists, the archaeologists, the historians all working together to untangle these complex mysteries and provide us with a richer understanding of the past.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this fascinating mystery, what's the key takeaway you hope our listener walks away with?
I hope it inspires a healthy dose of skepticism and curiosity. Remember, history isn't static, it's an ongoing conversation. As new discoveries are made and new perspectives emerge, we have a responsibility to re-examine our assumptions, question what we think we know, and be open to the possibility that even the most established narratives might need revising.
That's a great reminder. So to our listener, if this exploration of Drake's Landing has sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to keep exploring. There's a whole world of information out there waiting to be discovered. Why not delve into the rich history of the Curtis people, the Chinookan culture, or maybe even grab a copy of Melissa Derby's Thunder Go North and embark on your own historical detective work. And hey, while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future deep dives. We've got plenty more mysteries to unravel, stories to tell, and fascinating corners of history to explore together.
Until next time, keep asking questions and keep exploring. Remember, history is never truly settled. There's always more to learn, more to uncover, and more to understand about our shared past.